Welcome to Tech Empire. I'm Michael Quet, and today I'm excited to announce that a friend and colleague, Siamo Malachi, is going to be co-hosting the show. Siamo and I met online, and we worked together on something called the People's Tech Campaign, which we're going to be launching soon. And we're working on digital activism and things like that. So, Siamo, welcome to the show.
Great to be on the Tech Empire. The Tech Empire that we're trying to take down, that is.
For sure. Okay, so today we're going to be talking about social media, and we have on the show Jillian York. Jillian is a free expression activist and author. She serves as Director of International Freedom of Expression at the Electronic Frontier Foundation, and she's a founding member of Deep Lab. She is the author of Silicon Values, The Future of Free Speech Under Surveillance Capitalism, which was recently published at Verso Press. Jillian, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me.
All right, so today we're going to be talking about social media, the Frances Haugen documents about Facebook, and Jillian's book. We're going to cover free speech on social media, censorship, ideas about how to change it for the better at a structural level, things like that, as well as the pervasive problem of digital colonialism. Tech Empire is part of the Yale Podcast Network and can be found on SoundCloud, iTunes, and YouTube. On Twitter, visit Tech Empire Cast. My Twitter account is Michael_Quet, Kwet. Siamo's is She Malachi, that's TSHI MALATJI. And Jillian's is Jillian C. York. All right, so maybe I think this conversation is going to go in a lot of different directions, but let's start off with the Facebook and the Frances Haugen revelations. First of all, what were the really big things that she brought to the table for us? And Jillian, how did you interpret and see what happened throughout that whole affair so far?
Yeah, no, I think it's a great question. I mean, so there's a lot of stuff happening here. And I think, I'm going to focus on the stuff that I know the best, which are really the things around how certain users are treated with preference over other users. So there's a couple of key areas that the documents cover. One is the X-Check program this is one of the early leaks that was put out by the Wall Street Journal that looked at how certain verified users, but also public figures in various places all over the world, and this includes politicians, of course, are given preferential treatment when it comes to content moderation. And this is a huge deal. It was also not super surprising to me because it is very much in line with what Facebook's executive team, especially Nick Clegg, the vice president for, I think, global affairs, has said that, Facebook doesn't want to be in the business of moderating politicians. But contextually, this is so important because Facebook, as my book covers, has been in the business of moderating everyone else. And in some cases, censoring political speech in various countries throughout the world, censoring all kinds of artistic, journalistic, and other expression. And so, yeah, I mean, I think that this one was really stunning for me and for a lot of people just to have that evidence. The other big one for me, and this is much more my kind of core area, let's say, is the fact that, the documents demonstrated that Facebook's content moderation lacks any sort of real linguistic and cultural competence outside of English-speaking countries, as well as, a handful of European languages. So if you look at even Arabic, one of the biggest languages in the world, you've got really, really uneven content moderation. You've got a lack of moderators with the localized expertise, particularly at the country level. So, we're talking a language that has dozens of dialects, right? And that revelation to me should have been really, really important, but it's actually, it's gotten reported on quite a bit, but it's being talked about so much less than the stuff around, say, the way that the algorithms on Instagram affect teenagers. And that's really where my disappointment comes in, is that this could have been a true global conversation. And instead, what we're seeing is, Haugen going out and doing a tour of American and European lawmakers and saying a lot of things that do not represent what I feel the majority of global civil society experts want to see happen at these companies.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm very interested in knowing, Jillian, about the
Yeah.
discrepancies even among the political class. So,
Mm.
is there fairness in terms of not getting involved in politics, or is there revelations that this moderation skews toward not getting involved in certain kinds of politics?
Yeah, I would say it's a little bit of both. So when Trump got kicked off of Facebook and Twitter back in January, I was getting, all sorts of press calls around it, and the way that the media's focus on it was like, is this decision unprecedented? What does this mean for the rest of the world? And my answer was like, well, hold up a sec, because not only have we had some politicians and political figures such as, Burmese generals, maybe rightfully taken down. I'm not going to defend Burmese generals' genocidal speech, right? But you've also over the years seen the Iranian government basically deny, like deplatformed entirely due to tech companies' interpretations of US sanctions. You've seen you've seen the censorship or the deplatforming of certain politicians in other countries. One example that just comes to mind readily is Mohammed al-Baradei in Egypt, who was an opposition candidate, and he was kicked off the platform circa 2011 during the revolutionary period. And so this is not new; it's not unprecedented, and yet, to me, it's so clear at this point that the media and Western lawmakers really only care about it when it happens to their own.
Yeah. So obviously there was this big focus on putting profit over people, the body images of, teenage girls. And then there was also some pushback or some tension, I would put it as, from some people about how Frances Haugen conducts her politics and what she recommends, right? So she brought these documents to the table, and everybody should always be happy that somebody brings new information that is being kept from the public. So I think everybody across the board is appreciative if that comes through. But at the same time, she seemed to a lot of people conservative about how she thinks that what steps should be taken to remedy the situation. What did you think about that whole kind of ordeal?
Yeah, I mean, I think that there's a lot to unpack here. I mean, I want to just go back real quick and say that you mentioned profit over people, which is, the theme right now, and also one of the titles of a chapter in my book. And I think that is really the underlying theme of all of these documents that we've seen so far, is that these companies do put profit and certain Western and US in particular interests over the people, both, in those countries and around the world. So in terms of Haugen's choices around politics, I mean, look, like I very much appreciate the fact that she did bring these papers forward. And I think first and foremost, I want to give her credit for blowing the whistle on this company. I also want to note, she's not the only one to do it. And why aren't we talking about the things that Sophie Zhang, for example, brought to the table? So there is a lot else there. And there's also other leakers within these companies that don't, come out publicly, but have been sharing documents for years with journalists. And I think we gotta note that. Now, that being said, it can be very frustrating when whistleblowers try to be policy experts. I think that there's a couple of reasons why that happens. And one of them is that when you blow the whistle, you often don't get any institutional support. You're often not able to, to pay the bills. And I know she's not in that circumstance, but there are many whistleblowers who are. And so I do understand why they go in this direction. On the other hand, she's not alone in this. Like there's the Politico story this week that showed, that she's getting quite a bit of funding from Piero Madeira's foundations. She's working with, as far as I understand, she was working with various lawmakers. I don't have details on that, nor would I want to get into it per se, because I think really it's more about the fact that these aren't just her views. She's not just one person going around and touring. If she was, I'm not sure it would have this much of an impact. I think it's really the fact that she is representing a certain political class, and that class is not only not in line with global civil society. I know that's kind of an amorphous term, but I guess I'm thinking of the academics, the activists the politicians who've been working on digital rights for a long time, but also really out of line with Yeah. Sorry, I think that sentence kind of got away from me, but yeah, she's not in line with what global civil society experts think, and it's very much the positions she's taking around interoperability, around competition, and around certain online harms issues. And I definitely want to come back to the Instagram stuff. Are not that different from Facebook's own positions.
Yeah.
So Jillian, I like that mention of the various dynamics that go into people that are on the inside whistleblowing and speaking out against the awful stuff that tech companies have been doing. A lot of the time you have these walkouts from these large tech corporations. We've had whistleblowing in the past before. But what's so new about this? So what makes the Hogan revelations a special kind of information, revolt? Do you expect we'll get more insiders revolting against their corporations? You saw the big dilemma was going quite viral. Lots of former tech big people saying we regret some of the decisions we've made in the past. Are we basically seeing this new golden moment of regret? And is it empty? Will it amount to anything? Are these insiders just trying to catch new checks before the empire falls with a new role of like messiahs or speaking out? What are we seeing from the insiders? What's happening?
Yeah, no, I think that's spot on. Maria Farrell, who's this incredible Irish writer, I actually had her on my podcast this week, but it'll be out in a couple of weeks. She wrote this great piece on The Conversationalist called "The Prodigal Tech Bro." It was about Tristan Harris, the guy who left Google and went on to found the Center for Humane Technology. And she's basically, looking at him as, and he's just kind of representative. I don't want to pick on him per se, because I think it is more systemic than that. I think that these whistleblowers and these folks leaving these companies, not all of them, but many of them, realize that they're on a sinking ship. And I think that some of them have political ambitions. I think some of them are just trying to make a living outside of Silicon Valley, because it is toxic, even if you work there. Like, I've had friends at all these companies. I'm not a purist. And they know what they're into. They know where they are. A lot of people there are really aware, but it's a way to make a living in a city that, where I think the minimum wage or the poverty wages in San Francisco are over $100,000 a year, just to put that in context for global listeners. And so, yeah, I think that people do realize they're on a sinking ship, and some of them, Haugen, I'm not clear on, but some of them are kind of true believers that they can change these processes. And that actually scares me a little bit more than the folks who are just, trying to get out of there.
Yeah. And, for me, I would consider myself more of a purist on that question of, working with big tech and for big tech. I've been looking at this for years, this question, and I'm going to be honest with you here. I've and myself, and not just myself, but other people who I talk to in the background who tune into these things have been almost afraid to say that we're not comfortable with the integration of big tech and also rich foundation money with the academic circuit and having ethical spokespersons. And if you look back at, say, protests against Palantir and so on, that position hasn't been taken. It hasn't been taken against the other tech companies. Microsoft is one that comes to mind. And we do have people who are starting to talk a little bit about this, who, in my view, also are guilty parties in this. So, one of the things that comes out of this is a question of, what do you do about this issue of the apparent normalization of the mixing of big tech with the academic circuit and with the intellectual circuits, especially in light of the fact that we don't really see this in other domains. We don't see Shell Oil ethics people or Pfizer, health ethics people. It seems like the left wouldn't tolerate that, but it does seem to be tolerated in the tech world. So, kind of how do you make sense of all of that?
Yeah, I mean, so back to the purism question, just to set up my answer to this. I mean, I spent years being a purist on this stuff, and I've never worked for any of these companies, and I wouldn't take their money. But at the same time, I've also, given the context in which I've worked, I've found over the years that an incremental approach to the way that things are regulated, and the kind of particularly the self-regulatory practices of these companies, which um, I found that kind of trying to reform them has had small successes in certain places. So, for example, when Facebook silenced Palestinian activists earlier this year, we set up meetings. We started talking to Facebook on a probably bi-monthly basis, and got those accounts restored. Now, that doesn't solve anything systemically, but I feel like I can't avoid it. At the same time, I think it's a different question when we're thinking about the kind of the human rights, like Facebook has a human rights team now. They reached out to me at one point, and I was like, no. There's companies, Google, Facebook, sponsoring not only digital rights organizations, but like you said, academic work. And I think that, I wouldn't hold somebody accountable for choosing to do a policy fellowship or take money for a paper. But at the same time, I think that I think we do have to look at it systemically and tear it down from that angle, which I know you're all about, right? And so this is where the issue comes to me, is that I think there's been a lot of infighting and picking at people for their choices, but I'm not going to say nothing's ethical under capitalism. Nothing is, but more the fact that we got to consider the role that these companies and these big foundations are playing. They decide, who gets to take part in these spaces. They make or break this work, and it didn't used to be this way, and they've slowly crept in. And so I think we've got to start, stop the picking and start making sense of it. And I would like to see more of that. But I think that the interesting thing about it, and we were chatting about this before the recording started, is that I think social media exacerbates these issues. It disables us from being able to organize in meaningful ways against the way that these companies are kind of invading all of these spaces.
Yeah, and I just wanted to maybe ask that question of how far down the path of a reformist mindset has the quote unquote tech left gone, right? So as you know, that I wrote an article about, fixing Facebook. And so there's a question, it's not just Facebook, right? It's social media in general. And that's what your book is about. And I think this is an interesting question maybe to raise at this point is, how do we go about really this thing, right? Called social media. And maybe we'll circle back on the tech left on this, but, obviously, part of what social media does is allows people to rapidly exchange information and instantaneously communicate with each other. A platform like Twitter, most people default to, stranger danger mode, where you open your tweets up and you allow anybody to just start talking to you. So in a certain sense, there's a quote that sticks with me from Eben Moglen from a while back, and where he said, for the first time with the internet, these are the more glorious days of optimism. Humanity can hear itself think. But when you think about it, humanity, when we hear itself think, isn't always so great, right? And so the question becomes, obviously, we have corporations that own this. It's also by no mistake, we now have TikTok, but aside from that, they're American corporations. Mm-hmm. I think both Siamo and I agree that big tech in general and social media is an American empire project. Mm-hmm. And so there's a question about, but at the same time, I mean, it doesn't mean that if we had alternatives that were not based on corporate ownership, and we'll raise a question what they can look like, but it's not necessarily true that we're all going to be singing hands and singing Kumbaya and have no problems on here. So how do you look at the question of, is there what are the limitations on what can be done to make social media a more ideal space? And how do you relate that to issues of corporate ownership and, structural factors?
Yeah, I mean, I think you kind of can't avoid the question of the tech left in here. And I think it's helpful to say that, I came up in this work circa 2007, 2008, when all of it was like sunshine and rainbows and these, we're going to have revolutions and bring down governments with Facebook. And I mean, it was really that idealistic. And so, for me, there's kind of several tech lefts, not one, right? There's like the folks that I started working with who are mostly in the Middle East and North Africa, or definitely on the left, but who are working in a very, very different context where sometimes these American platforms are the better alternative because you can't necessarily meet, you can't necessarily publish. So I do often see it from that lens. I think then there's also, I'm in Germany where there is also kind of a tech left that avoids all of these platforms, uses open source everything, can't print because they're on a Linux machine. You know what I mean? Like that kind of thing. And then of course,
let's be nice to Linux here. It's not their fault.
It's not their fault. It's not their fault. It's your
the printers fault. Are not making the drivers available for Linux.
Oh, I know. And it's, I love the idealism. I also I like getting work done. So it's always tricky, right? But yeah, I mean, I think that, we do have to acknowledge, regardless of the utility of these platforms, that this is absolutely empire, as you said, and tools of US empire at this point, I would agree with. So, what can we do? I'm not optimistic right now, but I want to be. I'm thinking a lot about this, and I'm curious to hear your thoughts, both of your thoughts as well. I think that there are things that we need to do in terms of reform because these platforms aren't going away tomorrow. We do have to acknowledge the ways that people are still using them in a variety of global contexts. And I think right now, a lot of the conversations happening in Europe and the United States are just very focused on American and European problems. Nobody's considering my friends who are really, in Egypt, for example, who are really concerned about these platforms disappearing and content moderation taking down, their political speech as well as their history in some cases. I mean, documentation of Syrian stuff from the Syrian war has pretty much disappeared off a number of different platforms because, violent content, right? Or terrorism laws in the United States. And so, it's a struggle because on the one hand, I would love to see a lot of these platforms disappear. On the other hand, I don't know how we create alternatives that are not going to be subject to state censorship. And so you have to think about where you're putting the servers. You have to think about who gets left out when there's a high barrier to entry in using a certain type of platform. That's been the problem with a lot of the conversation around decentralized social networks for a long time, is that they're hard to use. And it's a simple problem, but it's actually quite a difficult one. And so I don't know. I've always personally believed it coming at it from all angles. I think we need to think about legislation, regulation. I think we also need to think about, bringing these companies to a baseline level of human rights, respect for human rights frameworks, international human rights frameworks. So yeah, I mean, I think I rambled on that one. I'm curious to hear your thoughts. But yeah, let me know if I didn't quite answer that question.
Yeah, I like what you're saying, Jillian, about who the tech left exists for. Even if we are attempting reforms, if we're attempting reforms with the objective of a very global North or Western oriented activist base, then those reforms, even if successful, obviously wouldn't help people on our side of the world. Or if they help, it will be incidental, like the rise of torrenting and political parties fighting intellectual property rights. You've got the Piracy Party in some European countries, and how that incidentally maybe might assist people on this side of the world with torrenting files. But it's not like they were setting out to do something like that. And that also exacerbates what you're talking about in terms of use. What language are these platforms in, and those sort of conversations. I kind of think that if the tech left wanted to be helpful whilst pursuing the reforms that they're trying to pursue, they'd at least try and create networks with people working in Global South, because there's no way for you to really know how you can assist and in what ways you need to assist if you're not even communicating. And, isn't that the point of the social media you're trying to reform, to create networks and connect the entire globe? And that's the 0708 Kumbaya piece you're kind of talking about. So I'd say that if they were genuine actors, the first step for the global North would be to just connect. Secondly, I think there is some connections, but it seems like there's a certain kind of global South tech lefty that they'll connect with. Someone that maybe won't challenge too much, or or just asks to change algorithms. So I'd wonder, maybe you can give your perspective,
Yeah.
even when it comes to global North, global South collaborations, why it might seem more toward co-opting or finding voices that are more comfortable to listen to. So in what ways do we get the tech left in the North to open up the kind of voices they listen to in the South? Because I'm very afraid
Yeah.
of just saying, listen to the global South, because there are many global Souths, which is what you also said earlier. There are many tech lefts in the
Yeah.
West as well. Yeah.
No, you're absolutely right. Like, so I think everything you're saying is right. I also think there's some complexity to that I see where so that work has been done in a lot of spaces. I'm not going to pat myself on the back, and I don't know if I'm talking to all the right people, but I know my networks in the Middle East and North Africa are pretty strong left networks. So let me just refer to them for a minute and put aside the rest of the world for this moment and just say that, in those contexts, I think that there's a phenomenon that happens when you are a white person in the global North, or a person in the global North for that matter. And you when you make these connections with people who are maybe further on the left than is acceptable in the United States or is acceptable in Europe, you get cut out of the conversation too. And I've personally felt that. I mean, I'm definitely not outside of the conversation, but there are plenty of mainstream folks who won't listen to me and won't listen to those folks as well. I've also seen this happen, I think the cooptation that you're talking about is very real. And I think that that's happening on a certain, I wouldn't even call it the tech left. I would call it kind of the tech liberals, right? I think that a lot of the cooptation that happens exists there. I think it's these, folks who are ostensibly left of center in the United States in particular, but also in Europe, who, are connected to these big foundations or connected to these big companies. And again, I'm not saying I'm a purist here. I'm not saying I'm far away from that, but I think that a lot of that networking has been tried. And the phenomenon is really that as soon as you go a little too far in your rhetoric, you get pushed out of those spaces, and particularly outside of legislative spaces, which is, a lot of what really matters right now. So it's tricky. And I agree with you. Absolutely. There's not one global South, but there are a lot of incredible voices that are doing the hard work on this. And I try my best to listen whenever I can.
Yeah, I have an idea though, Jillian, maybe we can talk about that. So if the issue is like, you have to straddle a line between being this radical agenda you're pursuing because you see that the system needs to change, and at the same time you're in a context where the system doesn't want you to be saying those things. You can be excluded from job opportunities, isolated from the legislative space, from your colleagues, from those that you need to organize with. Why don't we have movements that exist centralized around the global South that the global North supports? Like, for instance, Mike just had on his podcast last week activists here in South Africa fighting against Amazon really just expanding bases and data centers. And you can find stories abound of lithium mining in South America, cobalt mining in Central Africa, where, why don't we see a lot of the tech left maybe not pursuing, discourse and centralized movements on their side of the world, but just offering support to, a lot of the movements that need to still be established and organized in the global South? Would that also isolate?
No, I mean, I think that that's a great question. I think that that is in large part what needs to happen. It does exist to a certain degree. I mean, I think that one of the best examples I can think of, and you're probably familiar with them, they're based originally in South Africa, is the Association for Progressive Communications. This is, they're from there, but their network is global, and that is functionally what they're doing. Again, though, I think a lot of times the issues here are around funding. I mean, you end up when you refuse to take this money, and I've seen this happen so many times, you end up in a position where you don't have the ability to get to the places, to fly yourself wherever, to obviously the world's changed in a couple of years, so maybe we don't need to do that anymore. But you're kind of systematically cut out because of resources. And so it is always a really difficult line to straddle. And I think that there are few who do it well. But I agree with you. I mean, I think what those of us in the global North that have the resources to do need to do right now is find ways to support existing networks, rather than trying to create them ourselves, rather than trying to decide, who gets to be part of that conversation. And that's really the frustration that I'm having the past, couple of months in particular, but also for the past couple of years since we've been all so isolated, is that those conversations existed in a certain way before. They existed in the backstages of conferences, in the back rooms, in the, in the parking lot, over a cigarette, whatever. And those don't exist anymore. And I think that this is where, the people who do have the resources are the ones who, have been like the ones in government, the ones at the companies, the ones with the money.
Yeah. And I would add to that the universities, Yale Law School. I'm a visiting fellow at Yale Law School, in the Information Society Project. And Yale Law School has $1 billion endowment fund itself, just the law school. And then when I was in South Africa doing the PhD, you go to Walter Sisulu University and they don't have toilet paper, right? And you're like, well, but what? This actually does matter. It does matter because it's about agenda setting and it's about the reality that you live in and that you traverse. Now, since I've been at the ISP, I will say there are quite a few great people who I've met along the way and who are members of the ISP. But what I did find is that the bigger names, I've been there since 2017. I've been bringing up American empire and digital colonialism. I've written quite a bit on it. Not interested. We're not talking about this. Now, you have a situation in which the United States is 4% of the world's population. They have 40% of the world's household assets. Their corporations dominate the world. They own the high-tech economy predominantly. There's no parity with China. And especially globally, a lot of China's tech is internal to China. And the bottom line is there's an unequal division of labor and exchange that ensues because of all of this. Now, if we can't talk about this is a basic fact. If you're an alien from outer space, you're looking down. You're going to see the small group of people, which is really the rich elites within American society, are dominating the rest of the world in various ways, and tech is definitely one of them. And so we have a situation in which this isn't even part of the conversation, right? Look at just the metaverse, right? I pitched an article to a few US outlets, and I got one landed only in the South African press. And it says, one of the things it brings up is not only is there a huge amount, and I do want to get your thoughts, Jillian, on the metaverse, just because it's fun to talk about, I guess. But not only is there a hype thing, like, are we going to be really wearing goggles all the time? Kind of stuff. Not. I can't imagine it. I've tried it, and it's a big gadget on your face. But even putting that aside, the billions of dollars being spent on this and the ones who are developing it, look at the corporations who are mentioned. They're systematically pretty much American corporations, right? And then there's a digital divide. When you're looking at a place like South Africa, half the population living on $3 a day or less, who's going to afford this? So nobody's mentioning American imperialism in this. Nobody's mentioning a digital divide and the waste of money on a flop-prone project when people are starving and all this kind of stuff. This should be basic. It should be in every left account. These points should be made, but there hasn't been a single one. And so you kind of look at this and you start saying to yourself, like, well, what's going on here? Why is it that this part of the conversation seems to be almost systematically excluded? And is this just about the fact that let's go back to the question of what to do. There's the regulating the tech, but the fact that you have American corporations owning it in the first place is not seemingly to be problematized. So, that to me then points to beyond just the foundation money in the big tech, it's the media and it's the elite universities that are very dominant in this conversation.
Yeah. And I want to bring up one aspect of this too, it kills me that it doesn't get talked about, which is, something in my book and in Profit Over People in particular, the fact that these companies put their offices elsewhere in the world in some of the most human rights violating countries. And I'm thinking of the UAE in particular. You've got Saudi Arabia, you've got a Saudi prince owning a large portion of Twitter shares. You've got all of this like really shady involvement with companies that countries that basically in part it seemed to exist to help the US repress people, right? Like let's not like get it twisted about what the UAE is all about. They repress their own people and they help, they've been working with the US on a lot of this for a long time. Most of the Gulf countries do. And so that's the other aspect of imperialism here, is that these companies are not only towing the State Department's line when it comes to the rest of the world, but then also actively helping those countries repress their own people. And so with the metaverse, I mean, I see it as a couple things. I see on the one hand, you've got a culture in Silicon Valley of people who, they don't just see the internet as a place to make the world a more open and connected place, to quote Facebook's previous mission statement. They see it as where they live, right? Like Mark Zuckerberg's video advertising the metaverse was stunning to me in the fact that he, pulls up this backdrop and it looks like Hawaii, which incidentally is a place where he's bought up a bunch of indigenous land, right? And so, this is very much a niche view of the world, and yet they're trying to make it everyone's experience in the world. And then, of course, you point out rightly that the digital divide means that this is not going to be everyone's experience. I mean, there's so much wrong with this. VR is nowhere near where, I can't even put it on my face without feeling nauseous. Like I can't use it. And this is true for a lot of women because it's tested on men. So there's a whole gendered aspect of this as well. There's just so much going on. And it kills me that the way that they timed this shift around the leaks, it's just stunning to me. I mean, I don't think that there's necessarily something conspiratorial going on here. I think that they were waiting for the right moment and found it. And maybe it's the other way around, but it is really striking that this is managed to serve to distract from some of the most heinous violations from this company. And I don't even think, I gotta say also, I don't even think we know the half of what's in these papers yet. They have, whoever's making these decisions has made choices to not release documents to many Global South journalists, or very few at all, frankly. I know that there's a handful now coming out in different parts of the world, but I don't know a single Arabic-speaking journalist who's gotten access. And I've been asking around. That is quite telling of what's going on here.
Yeah, and in terms of things to do about social media, so let's circle back to that, right? Social media is a very centralized space. We know that it's centralized in part because of network effects for the audience. Basically, that means that the more members of a particular network, the more attractive it becomes. And the companies have long decided not to allow the services to interoperate, meaning that you can't talk across the networks. And so if imagine having a telephone, the green phone, and you can only talk to people on green phone. And then the red phone, you can only talk to people on red phone. You're never going to have more than a few phones. And so that's in large part why we have only a few networks. There is an alternative way of doing this, and it's to interoperate. And then there are different versions of interoperability. But forcing interoperability is something that is on the table in the United States with the Access Act. But before we get there, there has long been in place kind of free and open source software community-driven project called the Fediverse, where you have a collection of social media networks that interoperate, and they're all based on, as far as I can see with the licenses listed, free and open source software. And not only can people talk to it, so they have like a Twitter clone, they have a Facebook clone. Mastodon is the most popular one with a few million users. And it's functional in the sense that it runs, right? Like it's not really talked about much, but it's there. And that could, serve as a prototype. I think there are flaws in it. Jillian, I'm curious to see what you say about that. I know you and Ethan and Zuckerman, if I'm not mistaken, have mentioned some things about it. But one of the things that we're looking at doing, because you have mentioned in the Global South, well, where are the servers? The American platforms are giving people in countries with repressive governments a space to actually be able to broadcast out, what they think, where they wouldn't otherwise have that. In this scenario, and say a decentralized Fediverse scenario, there would be a ton of networks, and it's actually relatively easy to create your own and relatively cheap. Mastodon itself offers a service that is makeshift, that is point and click, and you can make your own network. I did it. It costs almost nothing. That could be a lot for people who are very poor. But my point is that it's easy to make your own little network in this universe. So in terms of changing social media and making it different, so it's not dominated by corporations, so that it's starting to function and be more democratic. What do you think in terms of structural features and change? You're on mute.
The piece that I wrote with Ethan was a few years back, and I think that some of my views on this have changed. So the two key arguments that I felt personally back then were, one, that the barriers to entry were often high in the Fediverse, that a lot of the technologies that existed 5, 6, 10 years ago were difficult to use. People, if you weren't tax savvy, you couldn't really jump into this. And that was a fair critique back then. The other one, of course, is the idea that you can't take it being your network with you. So it's difficult to, first you've got to convince people to move to that site or to start accounts on a different site. Without interoperability, without forced interoperability, you're not able to communicate with people on those platforms from mainstream corporate centralized platforms. And so for a lot of people, it's maybe not a cost or a technical barrier. It's the matter of not wanting to leave the networks that they've spent years building. And I want to acknowledge that as a very real thing. I think for a lot of people, this really does matter. I mean, I don't use Facebook anymore, but I can't delete my account because there are people that I would just lose in the world, just would never be able to find them again. And so fair to acknowledge that point. But that being said, I think we do need to start thinking about the fact that perhaps these centralized networks are never going to be the right space to do organizing. They're not going to be the right space to have these global conversations. As you said, Twitter, people's perception of news on Twitter is incredibly skewed. They're only getting a tiny bit of it there. And so, I'm kind of thinking now more towards a hybrid approach where, okay, we're never going to get these platforms, or maybe we will, but I don't see these platforms disappearing. But I also don't think we need to give them our time, our data, our attention. Let them suffer, move away to these other networks. And now that the barrier to entry is so much lower, as you said, I think that a lot of the other concerns that I've had about the Fediverse in the past have kind of disappeared. That being said, I think that we advocates, academics, whoever, it's on us to kind of convince people to move away. And I think that hasn't happened to the degree that it could. I know that there's, I've been to hacker communities and hacker conferences for years. Nobody's really doing the work of making it attractive and known and available to people who are not in these communities. There is this kind of attitude that exists that has always been rather frustrating to me, this purism. And so, I'd like to do more here, and I think we all could.
Yeah, I think Mike and Jillian, I also think that there are active efforts being taken by these large tech companies to make moving away very inconvenient and difficult, apart from interoperability. So if you look at something like Free Basics, for instance, that Facebook was operating, they made deals with mobile operators in India, South Africa, Kenya, and countries around the world, mostly situated in the global south, to provide people with devices that you could access Facebook for free and a few other websites, but mostly Facebook-oriented websites like Messenger. For many people, Facebook is the internet. It's the first site they go onto. It's what they use to search for stuff, to communicate with everyone. And it's not because this is a user who looked at their options and then decided, okay, I want to use Facebook. It's because they were handed a device that Facebook is free on, and other sites, obviously, you're still going to be paying data for, because an agreement at the top level has been made between Facebook and mobile operators. And it applies like that, in some Southern African countries, you get this thing called a WhatsApp data bundle, where you pay a very minimal fee and you're able to use WhatsApp for the entire month for that little fee. And if you were to use any other messenger, you'd be paying regular data prices, only because Facebook has signed a deal with major mobile operators. So, those are both financial, but also structural things that, and I think it's also this new focus on the global South as a market, I think the tech companies are realizing that a lot of the people in the North are maybe downloading Signal, for stupid reasons like Elon Musk tweeting it, or for whatever reason they're migrating. But it's very easy when you have a very low, I don't know what's the technical word, when there's not a lot of subscribers. That's the word they use. You've got these people that have never had a cell phone before. Okay, make sure that their first cell phone comes with all of our bloatware installed. Make sure that accessing Facebook is very cheap. So I saw there was a movement against net neutrality, and that was the major fight against free basics, that Facebook is choosing what aspects of the internet people can access. And I do think that's a radical fight that lots of people are fighting. And it did seem like that was gaining traction. But don't you think something else that will help with these alternatives, is how do we reduce the power of these large corporations to even set deals with mobile operators and control literally the internet that people in the global South are experiencing? Because many people won't even have the option to choose an alternative. Facebook is, well, all they know.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I mean, I do think it is a network neutrality issue, not entirely, but I think in large part, the part of the issue here is that if companies have the right to offer people, bundles like that, cheaper bundles or free bundles, then they're going to. And so I think obviously there are definitely other political solutions toward creating barriers to them making those deals in the first place. I got to say that's probably beyond my personal political expertise, but I absolutely agree with you. But I think that the net neutrality fight is also a really important one. And we saw in India, we saw extraordinary pushback against free basics there when Facebook tried to make those deals with the Indian government. I think when it wasn't even called Free Basics back then, it might have been Facebook Zero. Notice that they've rebranded like 3 times because of this political fight. And I think that that's really telling. I think you're also really right that it's not just a matter of cost. I mean, for some people it is, but for some it is a matter of the next billion people coming online and, getting their first cell phone and having this option that's just easy and readily available to them. I know that, for example, I haven't owned a television in like 15 years or a car, but if I was going to buy either of those things, I would probably just walk into the store and buy whatever they told me to buy. Right. And so I'm not, I definitely don't want to hold people accountable to this. I think, as you're saying, and as I think we all agree, it's a systemic problem that requires a political solution.
Yeah, and I would add to that it requires a more internationalist orientation towards technology. Yes. Because honestly, the word reparations is, it's there in the environmental movement, but it's not here in the tech movement. And there's a responsibility, in my view, to try to help out development in the global South in ways that are, based on reparations. And so that could be anything from physical infrastructure development. Instead of setting up your cloud centers, Microsoft and Amazon in the global South, so that you can colonize the cloud infrastructure, part of the world, actually donating technology to the extent that you want to use cloud computing, server farms, into the global South to help them develop the physical infrastructure. Now, if we look at the mindset, again, going back to the tech left, there seems to be at the furthest left end of the spectrum that is relatively mainstream. You have AntiTrust and maybe some progressive complements, right? So you can do progressive taxation. You could start developing digital public infrastructure as a public option. And but AntiTrust in particular I don't see it ever criticized. And I find that interesting. And the reason I find that interesting is that the fundamental premise, and being at the law school here at Yale, I've spent a lot of time on it. The fundamental premise, if you go back throughout the history up to today, is that competitive capitalism is the proper model for society, and that the tech giants are basically bullies that distort the market. Right. And also the orientation of AntiTrust is towards a national base. So if you look at the American, report that was put out, it's about harms to American consumers. UK, it's harms to UK consumers, and so on. And they're seeking to remedy for their national base. So in terms of that, I just thought that was something that interested me. And, if we are going to start looking about, at this from an internationalist perspective, I think that we have to start raising these questions too.
Yeah, I mean, I think that, the way that I see it, and this is very non-academic of me, I got to say, this is just pretty plain, but the way that I see it is that a lot of the conversations about how to reform tech happen in a bubble that contains lawyers, some academics from other fields, activists, and, again, people who are looking at tech and looking for tech related solutions. And so within that vacuum, antitrust makes sense, right? Because it does solve some problems. I'll give it that.
It's better than nothing.
Yeah, it's definitely better than nothing.
Yeah.
And I'm not against it for that reason. But I think that there's also a couple things going on here. One is that I think a lot of these people, whether, whatever their politics are, but especially if they are on the left, a lot of us don't see the possibility, or I don't want to say a lot of us because I do, right? But a lot of people don't see the possibility for holistic changes, for political changes. And there is, it's not just this. I mean, people view the speech issues in a vacuum, and we haven't talked about that as much. But, we're slapping censorship on a whole bunch of different problems. And I'm not an absolutist. I'm not saying that there aren't things that we want to get rid of in society, but so many of these solutions coming from the United Kingdom, from Australia, from the US, are looking at, only censoring speech that people are demanding in those cultural contexts. They're not looking at the impact that slapping automation on those processes is going to have on political speech elsewhere in the world, on even on counter speech elsewhere in the world. And so I think that that's the real problem, is this field's tendency to view all of these problems within a vacuum and not look beyond them toward holistic measures. And I think that's because, those are hard. We're all exhausted. We're in a pandemic. I mean, I get why we're here, but I don't want us to be here. And I want to start moving that conversation forward.
Yeah, Jillian, can I ask you about that? What kind of movement we're heading towards? Because I see your work, you've got a lot of this focus on comparing what's happening in the more western, northern parts of the world and the ramifications that has on Middle East, Global South, Latin America, Africa region of the world. And there's many examples, of words that are slurs in some parts of the world, but are cultural terms in another. If you set that to be auto-moderated, then you're sort of only assisting one part of the world that experiences that issue, but at the detriment of another part of the world. How do we address this? It's come up a lot in this podcast. How do we address, foreign government takedown requests? How do we address, discrepancies in geolocation filtering? What are some of the things that we got to do to address some of the discrepancies you're seeing in your work?
Yeah, I think the first step, and I'll probably get in trouble for saying this, but I'm going to say it anyway, this represents my views and my views alone, is I think we got to get automation out of content moderation. It doesn't belong there. We need humans. We need a human in the loop in every single process. Now, that comes with a cost as well, which means that we need to think about the frameworks that we're using for speech moderation in the first place. And right now, those frameworks are whatever Mark Zuckerberg thinks and believes. They're not based on international human rights norms, whether that's the right norm. I think that international human rights frameworks are the correct norm. We may need to update those frameworks for the 21st century, but nevertheless, there's a reason that the world came together around these ideas, and we got to bring it back to that. I've criticized the morality exception in Article 19 pretty openly, so that is what it is. But nevertheless, I think we have these norms for a reason, and so that requires going back and thinking, okay, we're looking at the rule sets that these companies have. You can see so many places where the rules are based on either, again, Mark Zuckerberg's personal beliefs and interests, or on advertisers' interests. So the bans on nudity, sexual content, that absolutely comes down to advertisers and money, profit. But then, certain things like the way that these companies over comply with US sanctions, as well as what's the word I'm looking for? The material support laws around the US Foreign Terrorism Organization list. That sort of stuff is the reason that you see Syrian content, Syrian documentation of war crimes, all sorts of other things that need to be preserved. That's why you see that stuff disappeared. And so that's, without even getting into what you were mentioning. I think that the thing about maps is a really hard problem. And I got to talk to some cartographers before I answer that one. But yeah, nevertheless, I think that we have to redesign these concepts from the ground up. And we're not going to get to these solutions as long as these people are in charge.
Do you think that like content moderation across borders, I think is really interesting because on the one hand, well, first of all, I think the number floated out there for Facebook is they have 40,000 content moderators, and they're primarily focused on the global north. But one of the questions is, well, do we really want to have 200,000 Facebook workers entrenching the power of Facebook and, spread throughout the world, right? So if we don't want something like that, then we still want human content moderators, but it does seem like a very expensive task, right? Just because the sheer amount of content that is spewing across the network at any, moment in time is enormous. And it's very difficult for content moderators to handle it. And then on top of that, right, if we're looking at a more decentralized system, if we were thinking back with the Fediverse, you can potentially be living in Egypt or Saudi Arabia, but you can join a network in the United States or Germany or Denmark or wherever, South Africa, and you can get around the idea of, instead, if we're socializing the networks, it doesn't have to be on a state ownership model in that sense. But if you have content moderators, you're probably not going to have people living in the United States or South Africa who know how to handle content moderation in Saudi Arabia, right? So, and at that point, if you're looking at content moderators who are being hired to handle your local context in repressive societies, you're going to probably see a big issue with that. So, what do you think about that dynamic?
Yeah, I mean, just like on the one hand, I don't think that we can censor ourselves out of these problems, out of our societal issues. Again, I'm not an absolutist, but nevertheless, I'm not sure that censorship really solves any problems. It slaps a Band-Aid on certain really vile ones for sure. And I mean, we certainly don't want government officials being able to call for genocide on these platforms. That's obvious. But at the same time, there is a solutionism around this that if we could just get perfect policing online, then we're gonna solve all of society's problems. Well, policing has never worked, number one, and number two, we have expectations for online spaces that we don't have offline, and so that's one thing, is we've got to reconcile this kind of fractured mindset towards the online world and offline world. But I agree with what you're saying as well, that I think this is where different types of tools come in that come from less of a, what I hate this phrasing, but kind of a leave up, take down perspective, and one that looks toward, okay, how do we create friction in the technology itself? How do we, if somebody's spamming the network, if somebody's sending 1,000 messages in a short period of time, how do you create friction there so that that's not going on? That works for things like botnets, but we're not doing that. And then I think, giving users more tools to be able to filter out speech for themselves or for their communities. We're starting to see this happen on certain networks. Again, usually in less corporatized, less centralized networks, but it does exist within Twitter to a certain degree. For example, the fact that Twitter's API is open so that you can create block lists outside of that is really, really helpful when you're dealing with a political situation that has gotten whatever word I'm looking for here, problematic, I don't know, violent. So, I mean, I think that we do need to look beyond this traditional, let's just police the internet approach. And I think that that's where, a lot of this comes in. I also think cultural competence and linguistic competence is absolutely vital, whether we're talking about the Fediverse or we're talking about Facebook. And that is part of the problem here, is that so much of the resources go towards the global north, and so few of them go into making sure that people are even moderating in the correct language. And then put that aside, I mean, we've seen the issues come out with the Facebook papers around, you've got Moroccans in their dialect moderating for Egypt and getting 90% of it wrong or something. But then you've got entire countries where there's no moderation in the local language. I think Uganda is the example that comes to mind often, because you have seen violence there in the past few years. And you've also got, I think, no moderators working in Uganda. Just one example, I'm guessing it's not the only one. So yeah, I mean, I think that there's a whole different range of tools that need to come into the arsenal. And it's not just going to be one of these answers. I agree, like you can't just slap more human moderators on the problem, but it is a part of it.
Yeah. And one of the things you say towards the end of your book, and I do want to recommend to anybody listening to check out Silicon Values, because you really spent a lot of years building into that work, and you've worked all over the world. So it's really there's just a ton of things in there to really get a sense of the spectrum, especially on content moderation issues. But you say towards the end, you say we must consider not the question of freedom of speech, but freedom of reach. Hate speech is far less of an issue when the person spewing it has just a few listeners. But on today's social media platforms, anyone can become an influencer, and recommendation algorithms all but guarantee that, controversial content will float to the top. Now, even if we got rid of those algorithms, you seem to say towards the end of the book, now this is from memory, that you were more, everybody wants some censorship, right? In the sense that we don't want to go on there and just like be subjected to gore and disturbing things. And, nobody would want a free for all. At the same, within the legal limits, right? Obviously things that are illegal, like non-consensual porn and things like that should, of course, always be banned. But there is a question of how to deal with this issue, because on the one hand, yes, people die when things are spread that are rumors about, say, a gang rape in India, and its misinformation wasn't even true in the first place. On the other hand, there's the question of, where do you draw lines about, what people are allowed to share and who can become an influencer even when they're messed up. In addition to that, I would add, before we even had the rise of social media, we had things like the Iraq War, which was basically based on lies. And nobody would sit there and say, let's ban the New York Times, right, for having in these other corporate media. So what do you think about this tension between freedom of speech and freedom of reach? What would you say to somebody who says, yeah, but is this really adding extra censorship? Is that really the right way to go about it? Is it the case that the rest of society is just messed up and we got to hit it at the level of schools and things like that?
Yeah, I mean, I got to be honest, I'm still there. I spent a lot of writing the book, going back and forth and debating myself about what I really believe. And I try to do that all the time, right? And it makes me come across as a little frenetic, I'm sure. But at the same time, I think that that's what we have to do. If we really, like, anyone who comes across as having all the solutions is somebody that I'm really, really wary of. So yeah, I got to say, I am still for less censorship, not more censorship. I am very much a believer, like I said, in Article 19, in the idea that everyone shall have the right to hold opinions without interference. But I also, I recognize that there are limitations to that, although I'm going to pick on that morality clause for the rest of my life. That being said, I think that right now, and again, I'm better at pointing out problems than I am at finding the solutions, which is why it's so important that we're all working together on this. But one of the things that I feel that I've rightly pointed out here is that these companies have absolutely preferenced the rights of certain speakers over others. They're playing a very similar and maybe even more dangerous game of gatekeeping than the New York Times was, because they are saying, by giving people verification, by not moderating them to the same degree as other people, they're effectively meddling. They're meddling in the world's politics. They're meddling in all sorts of things. And so that's a piece of it. And then I think the other piece of it is that we do want people to have reach. I don't want a governance of the elites. I do want everyone to be able to have some sort of reach. Whether we put friction into those processes and go after the botnets and all of that is another question to me. But the way that the algorithm does things, like we've all seen, like Twitter and Instagram, people talking about being shadow banned, and particularly right now it's people who talk about sex, sexuality, sex workers in particular. And so, why are their voices devalued in that way? Why are they less important than anyone else? Why are they less important than a politician? And so that's the game that these companies are playing. I think that the other thing here really is that, when we talk about things like disinformation, which is protected speech in the US, but also under international rights frameworks, we do have to tackle it at the root level. I mean, I was taught that Columbus discovered America, for example. And so, how can the US government or how can Facebook then come in and say that they're going to be the arbiter of what is or is not mis or disinformation? It's definitely a real problem in our society, but it's a problem that we have to fix at the societal level. And I know that sounds like an easy out, but I don't see how technology is going to solve that problem.
Yeah. So maybe we'll throw, unless you have any last questions, Siamo, maybe we'll put a last question here. One of my favorite podcasts is called This Is Hell, and they have at the end the question from hell. And so maybe we'll do a little mashup here and say, social media is pretty crazy. And, the question of, how much can we really do? Can we fix it? Can we make it much, much better? Is it just doomed to failure? Is it just fucked up? Is it the case that people in general are messed up? And that's really what we're looking at. And then we can tinker around the edges. We're all going to keep living, knock wood, for a number of years. So where do you see this going? Do you think what we have is what we're stuck with for the most part, the core character? Or do you think that it could be fundamentally different? And that, where do you see all of this going with the future direction of social media?
I try to be an optimist, coming back to optimism after a couple of years of despair. And so, I would say that I do think that it can be different, but I think that it's going to take some serious change in how we organize and some serious change in how we deal with regulation and, sort of the political conversation around these topics. If lawmakers and civil society and academics in the North don't start not just listening, because, okay, maybe they can listen, but don't start listening, but actually radically including different people in these conversations, we're not going to get anywhere. So it's a yes, but it's a big if.
Yeah. I think let's keep the optimism. Maybe that's not a question from hell in the end.
Hey, I think it's great. I really enjoyed talking with you both, and I would love to keep the optimism going.
For sure. All right. So, Jillian, thank you so much for coming on the show. This was really a fun one. Siamo, it was awesome having you start up the co-hosting. This is great.
Yeah, it's great to be in a tech empire.
Yeah. And Silicon Values, check it out on Verso Press.